There is a kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with the hour. It is the tiredness of a mind that always wants the next thing, the next purchase, the next achievement, the next small improvement to a life that, if you looked at it plainly, was already enough. Lao Tzu, the old teacher behind the Tao Jing, known in the West as the Tao Te Ching, saw this restlessness clearly, long before there were screens to feed it. He taught that the one who knows enough is already rich, regardless of what sits in their hands. Tonight is not a lesson. It is an invitation to stop reaching, just for a while, and notice what was quietly already enough. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. You do not need to have read a single page of old philosophy. You only need to recognize a feeling, the small itch that says you should want more, achieve more, become more, even when you are lying in the dark and your body is asking only for rest. That itch is common. It is human. And tonight, we are simply going to look at it together, gently, without judgment. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you're a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Over the chapters ahead, we will walk through old teachings about contentment, about the senses that pull us outward, about the cup that spills when filled past the brim. We will meet a merchant who could not stop counting coins, a farmer who measured his harvest against his neighbors, a builder who kept adding rooms to a house that was already finished. None of these stories will tell you what to do. They will simply sit beside you, the way an old friend sits beside you without needing to fix anything. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw soften. There is no test at the end of this, no achievement to unlock. Just a voice in the dark and an old idea, turning over slowly enough that you might drift before it finishes. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. Lao Tzu wrote that he who knows he has enough is rich, not he who has much, not he who has finally arrived somewhere, simply he who knows. This is a strange kind of wealth, because it does not depend on the world changing at all. It depends only on the mind turning to face what is already here. Most of us spend our lives waiting for enough to arrive from outside, like a letter that never comes. But Taoist teaching points the other way, toward a recognizing that can happen right now, in this breath, regardless of circumstance. Riches, in this sense, are not counted. They are noticed. And the one who notices what they already hold has already quietly become wealthy. In a small village at the edge of a wide river, there lived a merchant who had grown wealthy trading silk and spice. His warehouses were full. His ledgers, when added up, showed more gold than most men in the region would see in 3 lifetimes. And yet, each evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, He sat at his desk and counted his coins again, as if a different number might appear if he counted carefully enough. One evening an old traveller knocked at his gate, asking only for water and a place to rest before continuing on. The merchant, who prided himself on his hospitality, invited the man in and gave him a simple meal. As they ate, the traveller noticed the ledgers stacked on the merchant's desk and the abacus beside them, its beads still warm from use. "You count often," the traveller said. "Every evening," the merchant admitted. "I want to know exactly where I stand." "And where do you stand?" The merchant frowned. It was a strange question. "I stand well," he said, "better than most." "Then why count again tomorrow?" The merchant opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He had never thought to ask himself that question. "Because," he finally said, "there might be more tomorrow than there was tonight." The traveller nodded slowly, as if this were the answer he had expected all along. He did not argue. He simply asked for another cup of tea, and the two men sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets outside. "May I tell you something I noticed on the road?" the traveller asked eventually. "Please. I passed a beggar this morning, asleep beneath a fig tree, smiling in his sleep. And I passed a nobleman's house an hour later, and through the window I saw the nobleman pacing, unable to rest, worried about a shipment that had not yet arrived. I wondered which man was richer." The merchant said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "The beggar had nothing to lose." "Perhaps," the traveller said. "Or perhaps the beggar had already counted what he had and found it enough, and so there was nothing left to chase. The nobleman, I imagine, had much more than the beggar, but he had not yet finished counting. Some men never finish." The merchant looked at his ledgers again, differently now, as though seeing an old object from a new angle. "I have never once finished counting," he said quietly. "I always believed there might be one more coin to find, one more figure I have misjudged. I tell myself I will rest once the number is certain, but the number is never certain. There is always a transaction still in motion, somewhere on a ship I cannot see. And when the ship arrives, then there is another ship." The traveller smiled, but did not press further. He simply finished his tea and thanked the merchant for his kindness, and the two sat together a while longer without speaking, watching the lamp burn low. Before he left the following morning, the traveller paused at the gate. "I will tell you something my own teacher told me long ago when I was young and restless and certain that happiness was always one harvest away," he said. "She told me that the wealthy man is not the one with the largest number, but the one who can look at his number, whatever it is, and say, 'This is enough,' without flinching." "And did you believe her?" "Not for many years," the traveller admitted. "I argued with her the way you might be arguing with me now, quietly, in your own mind. I told her that surely more security was always better than less, that a man who had 10 coins was safer than a man who had 9. She did not disagree. She only asked me how many coins would finally make me feel safe. I told her a number. Years later, when I reached that number, I found I needed a new one." The merchant's hand drifted, almost without his noticing, toward the ledger, then stopped. He did not push it away. He simply let it rest there, unopened for the first time in longer than he could remember. The traveller continued on his journey that day, and the merchant did not see him again. But that evening, when the sun fell behind the hills as it always did, the merchant sat at his desk, looked at his ledgers, and did not open them. He simply sat, hands folded, watching the lamp flicker, wondering what it might feel like to already be standing somewhere instead of always traveling toward a place called enough. He did not become a different man overnight. The pull to count remained, and some evenings he gave in to it. But other evenings, more and more as the seasons turned, he found he could sit at his desk and simply notice the weight of what was already his, without needing to translate it into a number. He never told anyone what had changed. He only noticed that his sleep, in time, became a little easier to find. There was one evening, perhaps a year later, when a younger merchant visited him, eager for advice on how to build the kind of fortune the older man had clearly built. The younger merchant looked around the warehouse with open envy, asking question after question about trade routes and margins and which ports paid the fairest prices. The merchant listened patiently, answering what he could, until the younger man finally asked the question that seemed to matter most to him. "How will I know," he asked, "when I have finally made enough to stop worrying?" The merchant considered this for a long moment, remembering the traveller who had once sat across from him at this same table. "I used to believe," he said slowly, "that the worrying would stop once the number was large enough. I chased that number for many years." "And did it stop once you reached it?" "There was no number," the merchant admitted. "I kept raising it every time I came close. I do not think the number was ever the actual obstacle." "Then what was?" "A habit of looking at what I lacked rather than at what I already held. I learned late to practice looking the other way. It did not happen all at once. Some evenings I still catch myself reaching for the ledger out of old habit, the way you might reach for a familiar tool even after you no longer need it for the job at hand." The younger merchant left that evening unconvinced, eager still to chase the larger number he had come seeking advice about. The older merchant did not try to stop him. He recognized in the young man's hurry something of his own younger self, and understood that some lessons cannot be handed across a table. They have to be lived through, slowly, evening by evening, the way his own had been. In Sufi poetry, there is a similar understanding of this restlessness, often spoken of as the heart's habit of always reaching past the cup in its own hands. The poet Rumi wrote of a man searching everywhere for a treasure that was buried the whole time beneath his own house. He searches villages and deserts, asking strangers, certain that treasure must be somewhere else, somewhere harder to reach. Only at the end does he learn what the wise already suspected, that what he sought had been near him from the beginning. This image carries two teachings worth holding on to tonight. The first is that seeking itself can become the obstacle, a habit so practiced it forgets to stop even after the goal has technically been reached. The second is gentler still, that the treasure was never truly lost. It was only unnoticed, the way a familiar room becomes invisible simply because we walk through it every day without looking. Sufi teachers often describe the spiritual path not as an acquisition of something new, but as a remembering of what was quietly always present, hidden in plain sight beneath the noise of constant wanting. You may recognize this pattern in your own life. The promotion that once reached simply reveals the next rung of the ladder. The bigger house that once purchased reveals a kitchen that suddenly seems too small. The way a new possession feels exciting for a week and then becomes furniture invisible, while your attention slides forward to the next thing you do not yet have. Perhaps you have scrolled through other people's lives online, comparing your evening to their highlight reel, certain that they have found the enough that still eludes you. This is the merchant's ledger, dressed in modern clothes. The counting never stops because the goalpost keeps moving, quietly, just ahead of wherever you currently stand. Tonight, you do not need to solve this. You only need to feel, for a moment, what it might be like to stop counting. Not forever, just for these few minutes, in this bed, in this dark room. Let your hands rest the way the merchant's hands finally rested on the closed ledger. There is nothing to add up right now. There is nothing missing from this moment that sleep requires you to find first. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is no calamity, Lao Tzu taught, like not knowing what is enough. He did not say this lightly. He placed it among the gravest dangers a person could face, alongside greed and grasping, because a mind that cannot recognize sufficiency will suffer no matter how much it gathers. This is a quiet kind of disaster, one that rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a single dramatic loss. It arrives slowly as a permanent low hum of dissatisfaction, present even on the best days, even when life is by any outward measure going well. The danger is not having too little. The danger is a mind trained never to notice when it has enough, and without that noticing, no harvest, however large, will ever feel like it was sufficient. There was once a farmer who worked a wide field at the base of a mountain, and each autumn, when the harvest came in, he walked to the edge of his land and looked across the low stone wall at his neighbor's field. He counted the sacks of grain his neighbor had gathered, comparing them silently against his own, and no matter how full his own granary was, he returned home heavier than when he left, as though he had been carrying something invisible the whole way back. One year, his harvest was the best he had ever known. The rains had come at the right times, the soil had given generously, and his sacks of grain filled the granary to its very rafters. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, he walked to the stone wall as he always did, and found that his neighbor's harvest that same year was slightly larger still. He sat by the wall a long while, watching the wind move through the stubble of his neighbor's cut field, and did not notice the old woman who kept goats on the hillside until she was nearly beside him. "You look troubled for a man with a full granary," she said. "My neighbor's is fuller," the farmer said. The old woman looked across the wall, considering this. "It is," she agreed, "by perhaps 12 sacks by my eye." "Then I have failed." Failed at what? The farmer opened his mouth, then found he did not have a ready answer. "At having the most," he finally said. "Ah," said the old woman, And if you had 12 more sacks than him instead of 12 fewer, would you be satisfied then? The farmer considered this honestly, turning the question over the way he might turn a stone to see what lived beneath it. I think, he admitted slowly, I would worry that next year he might gain 15. The old woman smiled and sat down beside him on the low wall, letting her goats wander further down the hillside without concern. I have kept goats on this mountain for 40 years, she said. I have watched many harvests come and go below me. I have noticed something about the men who measure themselves against their neighbors. What have you noticed? That the measuring never ends, because there is always a neighbor with slightly more somewhere if you look far enough. Even the wealthiest man in the valley below has heard of someone wealthier still, in the city, in another country, in a story someone told him once. The line never finishes. You can climb it forever and still find someone standing one step above you. The farmer frowned. Then what am I supposed to measure myself against, if not against others? How will I know if I'm doing well? The old woman was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle above the far ridge. When I want to know if my goats are well, she said, I do not count my neighbor's goats. I look at my own. Are they fed? Are they healthy? Do they have water and shelter before the snow comes? None of that requires me to know what is happening in anyone else's pasture. But surely it matters whether I am falling behind. Behind whom? Toward what finish line? Tell me where the race ends, and I will agree the comparison is useful. But I have never met a man who could tell me where it ends. I have only met men who keep running. Me, I mean a man alike here. Me, I mean a man alike here in knowledge. The farmer looked down at his own field, the sacks stacked high in his barn, just visible through the open doors from where they sat. He tried for a moment to see it without the stone wall in his peripheral vision, without his neighbor's field beside it at all. It was difficult. He had looked across that wall so many autumns in a row that he had nearly forgotten his own field could be looked at alone. It is a full granary, he said slowly, as if testing the words. It is, the old woman agreed. It will feed my family well through the winter, with grain left to trade besides. It will. I worked it honestly, and the land gave generously this year. It did. The farmer let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Then perhaps, he said, it is enough, whatever sits across the wall. The old woman did not answer this directly. She only rose, called her goats back toward her with a low whistle, and began making her way back up the hillside. But before she left him, she turned once more. I will tell you the only measurement I trust, she said. Not whether you have more than your neighbor, only whether you can sit at the edge of your own field on an evening like this one and feel that it was a good year. That measurement does not require a wall at all. She left him there as the light began to fade, and the farmer remained a long while, watching the sun drop behind the mountain, trying the old woman's measurement against his own harvest, the way one might try on a coat that had been offered as a gift. It did not fit perfectly, not at first. The habit of looking across the wall was old, and old habits rarely leave the moment they are asked to. But he found that evening that for the length of one sunset at least, he could sit with his own field and call it enough. and that this feeling, however brief, was unlike anything counting his neighbor's sacks had ever given him. The following spring, as planting season began, his son, now old enough to work alongside him in the fields, asked why he no longer walked to the stone wall the way he used to every autumn. "I used to walk there every harvest," the farmer admitted, "to see how my field compared to your uncle's." "Did it help, knowing how you compared?" The farmer considered the question as he worked the soil, turning it over the way he had turned over the old woman's words many seasons earlier. "No," he said, "it never once helped. It only ever made a good harvest feel smaller than it actually was." "Then why did you keep doing it?" "Habit, I suppose. And fear dressed up as caution. I believed that comparing myself to your uncle would keep me sharp, would push me to work harder, to do better. I did not realize for many years that he was only making me miserable without actually improving anything about how I farmed." "What changed?" "An old woman who keeps goats on the hillside asked me a question I had never thought to ask myself. She asked whether I could simply look at my own field without the wall in view and call it good. It took me a long while to learn how to do that honestly." His son worked quietly beside him for a while, turning this over. "Do you think I will need to learn the same thing?" "Probably," the farmer said, smiling faintly. "I think most people do, sooner or later. The wall is always there if you choose to look toward it. The trick, I have found, is learning to plant your eyes elsewhere, back on your own soil, where the only harvest that actually matters to you is growing." In Lakota tradition, there is a similar understanding of this comparing mind, often addressed through the value of generosity rather than accumulation. Wealth in many Lakota communities was historically measured not by how much a person kept, but by how much they were able to give away, particularly through ceremonies like the giveaway, where a family's standing grew through what they shared rather than what they hoarded. A man who held everything tightly, refusing to circulate what he had, was not admired. He was seen as someone trapped, cut off from the relationships that gave wealth its actual meaning. Two threads run through this worth carrying tonight. First, that comparison built on private accumulation misses the point entirely, because the question was never how much one family held against another, but how well that family understood its place within a larger circle of mutual care. Second, that giving freely from sufficiency, rather than guarding against imagined scarcity, was itself treated as the mark of a person who had already found enough. The farmer's wall, in this light, was never really about grain. It was about a forgetting of the larger field both neighbors actually shared. You may know this feeling from a different kind of wall. The one built by comparing your career to a former classmate's, or your home to a friend's renovated kitchen, or your relationship to whatever a couple appears to share online. The comparison rarely makes you grateful for what you have. It usually makes the ground beneath you feel smaller, even when nothing about your life has actually changed. Perhaps you have caught yourself doing this with a sibling or a colleague who was promoted before you, measuring your own pace against theirs, as though there were only one correct speed for a life to move. The old woman's question is worth carrying with you now, in this dark room, away from any wall at all. Not is it more than theirs, only is it good. Was this a good day? Is this, tonight, in this bed, enough? Let yourself feel the difference between those two questions, rather than only thinking about it. Let the wall fall away, the way the farmers eventually did, even if only for the length of this breath, this night, this sinking towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that it is better to stop short than to fill a vessel to the brim. A cup overfilled does not hold more. It simply spills, wasting what care had been taken to pour it. This is a teaching about timing as much as quantity, about knowing when enough has been reached and resisting the pull to add one more measure just to see what happens. The instinct to keep pouring feels in the moment like ambition, like diligence, like care. But Taoist teaching suggests it is often something else entirely, a refusal to trust that the cup was ever going to be enough as it stood. There is a particular kind of wisdom in the hand that stops pouring while there is still room to spare, leaving something held rather than something lost. A young apprentice once served in the kitchen of a great house, learning under an old cook who was known throughout the province for the clarity of her broths and the precision of her hands. The apprentice was eager, perhaps too eager, and believed that more of anything good would always make a dish better. If a pinch of salt improved the flavor, he reasoned, then 2 pinches must improve it further still. One evening, preparing a delicate soup for a visiting official, the apprentice was given the task of pouring the broth into the serving bowls. The old cook had measured the portions carefully, leaving a careful margin near the rim of each bowl, room enough for the soup to be carried steadily without spilling onto the official's robes. The apprentice, wanting the official to feel especially well attended to, poured a little more into each bowl than the old cook had instructed. He told himself this was generosity, not error. Surely more broth meant a more generous host. He filled the bowls nearly to their rims, admiring how full and impressive they looked compared to the modest portions the cook had measured. When the servants carried the bowls toward the dining hall, the broth, jostled by even careful steps, slipped over the edges and onto the trays, the floor, and in one unfortunate case, onto the sleeve of the very official the apprentice had hoped to impress. The meal was delayed while new bowls were prepared, properly measured this time, and the apprentice stood mortified in the corner of the kitchen as the old cook calmly began again. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the kitchen had been cleaned, the apprentice sat on an overturned crate near the dying fire, replaying the evening's disaster in his mind. "You filled the bowls past where I told you," the old cook said, not unkindly, taking a seat across from him. "I wanted it to look generous," the apprentice admitted. "A fuller bowl seemed like more of a gift." And what did the fuller bowl become in the end? A mess, an apology, a wasted second batch. The old cook nodded slowly. "There is a teaching my own master gave me when I was young and eager, exactly as you are now. She told me that a cup filled to its very limit is no longer a cup you can carry. It becomes a hazard, a thing that demands all your attention simply to keep from spilling. A cup filled wisely, with room left near the rim, can be carried steadily, offered generously, and enjoyed without anxiety. But it has less in it, the apprentice said. Isn't less broth a smaller gift? Is a spilled bowl a larger gift than a full one that arrives safely at the table? The apprentice considered this. No, he admitted, the spilled bowl is worse than if I had simply given less to begin with. Then which is the true generosity? The impossible fullness that cannot survive the walk to the table, or the measured fullness that arrives exactly as intended? The apprentice was quiet for a long moment, watching the embers settle in the hearth. I think I have been confusing more with better, he finally said. I thought if I added enough, it would become impressive. But I never asked whether the bowl could actually hold what I was adding. That is the heart of it, the old cook said. Many things in this kitchen and in this life can hold more than they currently contain, but not everything that can hold more should be filled to that limit. A bowl filled 3/4 is still a full meal. A life filled generously with room left near the edges can still be carried steadily through the hardest days. It is the filling past the brim, the constant reaching for one measure more, that turns abundance into spillage. The apprentice thought about this for many nights afterwards, watching the old cook measure her portions with the same careful restraint each evening, never filling past where the bowl could be safely carried. He began to notice the same pattern elsewhere in the kitchen, in how she stocked the pantry, never to overflowing, in how she planned the week's meals, never so many dishes that the staff could not properly attend to each one. Years later, when the apprentice had grown old enough to train his own students, he found himself repeating the old cook's lesson nearly word for word, standing over a young cook who had filled the bowls a little too generously, watching the broth tremble dangerously near the rim. He did not need to say much. He simply pointed to the bowl and to the steady walk still ahead of it toward the table, and let the young cook see for himself what the fullness was about to cost. In Stoic philosophy, there is a similar understanding of this restraint, often discussed through the idea of living according to nature rather than according to appetite. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote at length about the dangers of excess, observing that it is not poverty that troubles most people, but the inability to set a limit on desire once it has been allowed to begin. He argued that the wealthy man who cannot stop wanting more is in every meaningful sense poorer than the modest man who has learned where to stop. This teaching offers two threads worth carrying tonight. First, that Stoic philosophers distinguished sharply between what is necessary and what is merely wanted, insisting that confusing the two is the root of most unnecessary suffering. Second, that the discipline of saying enough was treated not as a deprivation, but as a freedom. The freedom from a hunger that, left unchecked, can never actually be satisfied, no matter how much is poured into it. The cook's careful bowl and Seneca's careful appetite point toward the same quiet discipline practiced an ocean and many centuries apart. You may recognize this overfilling in your own life, the closet stretched past its limit with clothes you rarely wear, the calendar packed so tightly with commitments that none of them can be given proper attention, the meal eaten well past fullness simply because more food remained on the plate. Each of these is its own small bowl, filled past the brim, spilling something, time, attention, ease, that a more modest portion would have let you actually enjoy. Perhaps you have said yes to one more project at work, one more obligation, one more thing to manage, even as you felt your own capacity straining at the edges, certain that pulling back would look like giving up rather than knowing where to stop. Tonight, in this bed, there is nothing more to pour. The day is finished. The cup, whatever it held, has already been carried as far as it needed to go. Let yourself feel what it is to set the cup down without finishing it, the way the old cook always did, calmly, without apology, before the spilling ever had a chance to begin. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Contentment, Lao Tzu taught, never brings disgrace. Knowing when to stop never brings danger. This is a quiet promise, easy to overlook, but worth sitting with carefully. So much of our striving is driven by a fear that stopping will cost us something. Respect, opportunity, ground we cannot get back. Lao Tzu suggests the opposite is true. It is the inability to stop, the endless reaching past sufficiency, that tends to bring trouble, while the simple act of recognizing enough tends to bring safety instead. There is no shame in a life that knows its own edges. There is only relief, the kind that comes when a person finally stops measuring themselves against a horizon that keeps moving away. In a city known for its scholars, there lived a young woman who collected rare books with a passion that bordered on devotion. She had begun modestly, with a single shelf of texts inherited from her grandfather, but over the years her collection grew until it filled an entire room of her home, then spilled into the hallway, then began climbing the stairs in unsteady towers that her family had learned to step around carefully. She told herself each time she acquired a new volume that this one would be the last she truly needed, the missing piece that would finally complete her understanding. But there was always another text referenced within the pages of the one she had just finished, another author whose name appeared in a footnote, pulling her onward to the next acquisition. One autumn, an elderly scholar visited her home, having heard of her collection from a mutual friend. He moved slowly through the towers of books, examining spines, occasionally pulling one free to read its title before returning it carefully to its place. "You have read all of these?" he asked. She hesitated. "Most," she said. "Some I have not yet had time for." "How many would you guess remain unread?" She did the calculation in her head, and the number that emerged surprised even her. "Perhaps a third," she admitted. "And do you intend to read them?" "Of course. I simply have not reached them yet." The old scholar nodded and continued his slow walk through the room, pausing at a particularly precarious tower near the window. "May I ask why you continue acquiring new texts," he said, "when a third of what you already own remains unopened?" The young woman considered this question longer than she expected to need. "I am afraid," she finally said, "that if I stop searching, I will miss the one book that would have answered everything." "And has any single book so far answered everything?" "No," she admitted. "Each one answers a little and raises 3 new questions." "Then by your own account the searching does not end with an answer. It only continues, book after book, question after question." She frowned at this, though she could not immediately argue against it. "Are you suggesting I should stop reading?" "I'm suggesting nothing of the sort," the old scholar said, and here he finally smiled. The first time since he had entered the room. "Reading is a wonderful thing. I'm only asking whether your shelves are full because you love reading or because you are afraid of what it would mean to feel that you already have enough to read." The young woman sat down on a low stool near the window, the towers of books rising around her like a city she had built without quite meaning to. "I think," she said slowly, "I have confused having more books with becoming more learned, as though the number on the shelf were itself a kind of knowledge." "A common confusion," the old scholar said. "I made it myself in my own youth. I once owned more scrolls than I could carry in 2 arms, and I believed the weight of them in my home proved something about the weight of my mind. It did not. My mind grew not from owning the scrolls, but from sitting with the few I actually read closely, turning their ideas over until I understood them from more than one angle. What did you do with the rest?" "I gave many of them away to students who needed them more urgently than I did. I kept only what I returned to again and again, the handful of texts that had earned their place through use rather than through the promise of future use. My shelves grew smaller. My understanding, I believe, did not." The young woman looked around the room at the towers she had built, feeling something shift slightly in her chest, not quite sadness, not quite relief, but something between the two. "I do not think I am ready to give any of them away," she said honestly. "I am not asking you to," the old scholar said. "I'm only asking whether you might consider, the next time you feel the pull toward one more acquisition, pausing long enough to ask whether you are reaching for knowledge or reaching simply to feel for a moment, less afraid of not having enough." He left her then, having said what he had come to say, and the young woman sat a long while among her towers, watching the autumn light move slowly across their uneven spines. She did not stop collecting books after that visit, but she found in the months that followed that she paused more often before each new purchase, asking herself the old scholar's question, and that some of those pauses, more and more as the seasons turned, ended with her hand drawing back rather than reaching forward. She wrote to the old scholar the following spring, unsure whether her letter would even reach him, describing how she had begun reading her unread third more deliberately, choosing one volume at a time rather than scanning her shelves for whatever felt newest. She told him she still felt the old pull toward acquisition, especially when a friend mentioned a title she did not yet own, but that the pull had grown quieter, easier to notice before acting on it. He wrote back, briefly, in a hand that had grown shakier with age. He told her that he, too, still felt the pull occasionally, even after a lifetime of practicing against it, and that this did not trouble him the way it once had. The goal, he wrote, was never to stop feeling the reach entirely, The goal was simply to notice it clearly enough that she could choose each time whether to follow it or to let it pass, the way clouds pass over a hillside without needing to be chased. She kept that letter for the rest of her life, tucked into the pages of the very first book her grandfather had given her, the modest single shelf that had once been the entire collection. Before it became a city of towers, she had needed an old scholar's visit to finally see clearly. In Hindu philosophy, there is a similar understanding of this grasping, often discussed through the concept of aparigraha, or non-possessiveness, one of the restraints described in classical yogic teaching. Aparigraha does not demand that a person own nothing. It asks instead that a person hold what they have lightly, without clinging, recognizing that the grasping itself, more than the object grasped, is the true source of unrest. Two threads from this teaching are worth carrying tonight. First, that aparigraha distinguishes between need and accumulation, suggesting that gathering far beyond what is necessary tends to create anxiety about protecting and maintaining what has been gathered, rather than the security it promised. Second, that letting go of this grasping was taught not as a loss, but as a lightening, freeing attention that had been spent guarding possessions so it could be spent instead on presence, on relationship, on the unfolding moment. The scholar's towers of books, however precious each volume, had quietly become something to manage rather than something to enjoy. You may know this pattern through your own closets, your own digital folders full of saved articles you intend to read someday, your own habit of bookmarking recipes you will likely never cook, each unread book, each unused gadget bought for a hobby you tried briefly carries a small, invisible weight, a quiet reminder of an enough that was promised but never quite delivered. Perhaps you have noticed this same pull around your career, collecting certifications or credentials the way the scholar collected books, telling yourself that the next one will finally make you feel sufficiently prepared, sufficiently impressive, sufficiently safe. The old scholar's question is worth asking yourself now, in the dark, away from any shelf at all. Are you reaching for something you need, or reaching simply to outrun the feeling of not yet having enough? Let that question rest gently, without needing an answer tonight. Let your hands stay still, the way the young woman's eventually did, simply sitting among what she already owned, finding it, for this evening at least, sufficient. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The sage, Lao Tzu taught, does not let the senses run wild, chasing color and sound and flavor until the inner stillness is lost. The eyes want a brighter sight, the ears want a louder note, the tongue wants a sharper taste. Left unchecked, each sense pulls the mind further outward, away from the quiet center where contentment actually lives. This is not a teaching against pleasure itself. It is a teaching about pursuit, about the difference between enjoying what arrives and chasing what has not yet arrived. A mind that is always reaching toward the next sensation rarely has time to notice the sensation already present. The senses are not the enemy, the chasing. There was a young runner in a mountain village known across the region for his speed, who had won every race held within a day's walk of his home by the time he was 20 years old. Each victory should have settled something in him. Instead, each victory only revealed a faster runner somewhere else, in some other village, whose name reached him through travelers and traders, pulling him onward like a scent on the wind. He began traveling further to find harder races, tougher competitors, longer distances that might finally prove something to him that the shorter ones had not. He won most of these too, but the winning brought less and less relief each time, like a meal eaten quickly that never quite satisfies the hunger it was meant to answer. He noticed, eventually, that he could no longer remember the last time he had simply run for the pleasure of running, without a finish line waiting at the end of it. One spring, he traveled to a distant province to race against a runner whose reputation had reached even his own village, a man said to be untouched by fatigue, who had never once lost a race in 15 years of competing. The young runner trained harder than he ever had, certain that beating this man would finally be the victory that settled the restlessness in his chest for good. He lost, badly, and by a wide margin, in front of a crowd that had gathered specifically to watch him fail. He sat afterward at the edge of the racing field, his legs trembling, his pride more bruised than his body, and an old groundskeeper who tended the field's grass approached and sat beside him without asking permission. "You ran well," the groundskeeper said. "I lost." The young runner said, "You did. You also ran well. The two are not opposites." The young runner looked at the old man, irritated despite himself. What good is running well if I still lost? What good was winning all those other times if it never once made you feel as though you had finally arrived somewhere? The young runner opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because the old man had named something true that he had never said aloud to anyone. "How did you know that winning never satisfied me?" "Because I have watched many runners pass through this field over the years," the groundskeeper said. "The ones chasing something outside themselves always look the same after they cross the line. Their eyes go immediately to the next race, the next rival, before their breath has even slowed. The ones who run because they love the running itself, they finish, and they simply stand there, breathing, looking at the sky, in no hurry to be anywhere else. And which one am I? You tell me. When you crossed lines all those years undefeated, where did your eyes go?" The young runner thought back over years of races, hundreds of finish lines, and could not remember a single one where he had simply stood still afterwards, satisfied. His eyes, he realized, had already been searching for the next competitor, the next village, the next proof. "I do not think I have ever once felt that I had run enough," he admitted. "That is not a flaw in your legs," the groundskeeper said. "It is a flaw in what you have been asking your legs to prove. Speed cannot answer a question that was never about speed in the first place." Then what was the question actually about? The groundskeeper was quiet for a while, watching the crowd disperse from the field, the undefeated champion being congratulated somewhere in the distance. "I do not know," he finally said. That is a question only you can answer, sitting with yourself, away from any finish line at all. But I will tell you what I have noticed, in case it helps. The runners who eventually found some peace were not the ones who finally won enough races. They were the ones who learned to feel satisfied by a single good stride, a single clean breath, regardless of where they placed when the race ended. The young runner returned to his village that season, though he no longer traveled as far or as often to seek out new competitors. He still ran nearly every morning along the same mountain paths he had run as a boy. But he began noticing things he had stopped noticing somewhere along the way: the particular cold of morning air in his lungs, the sound his feet made against packed earth, the way the light changed color as the sun cleared the ridge. He did not run more slowly. He simply ran differently, with his attention finally landing somewhere other than the horizon ahead of him. He never became, by the old measures, the fastest runner anyone had heard of. But there were mornings, increasingly many of them, when he finished his run and simply stood at the edge of his own field, breathing, in no hurry to be anywhere else, and those mornings felt to him like something he had been chasing for a very long time, without knowing what it was called. Years later, a young boy from his village approached him after watching him run, asking to be trained the same way the old champion had once trained, hoping to learn the secrets behind the speed he still vaguely remembered hearing about. "I will teach you to run," the man said, "but I no longer teach the way I once learned." "What do you mean? When I trained, every run was measured against another runner somewhere who I had not yet beaten. I want to teach you something different. Tell me, when you run, what do you notice?" The boy considered this, clearly puzzled by the question. "I notice how far I have left to go. I notice whether I am ahead of the other boys." "Try this instead tomorrow morning. Notice your breath instead. Notice the ground beneath your feet. Notice the cold air entering your lungs. See what happens to the running itself once you stop measuring it against anyone else's pace." The boy tried this the following week, hesitant and unconvinced, certain that paying attention to his own breath rather than to his competitors would only slow him down. He returned several days later, troubled by what he had found. "I do not understand," he said. "I ran slower than I usually do, but I enjoyed it more than I ever have." "And which of those two things?" the old runner asked, smiling for what felt like the first time in the conversation. "Do you think you will actually remember, years from now, when you are too old to run quickly at all?" The boy did not answer immediately, but something in his face suggested he already suspected what the answer would eventually become. The same way the old runner himself had once suspected it, sitting bruised and defeated at the edge of a distant racing field, listening to a groundskeeper who tended grass for a living and somehow understood something about running that no trainer ever had. In Buddhist teaching, there is a similar understanding of this outward chasing, often described through the second noble truth, which names craving as the root of suffering. The Buddha taught that the mind's habit of grasping after pleasant experiences and pushing away unpleasant ones keeps a person locked in restlessness, regardless of how many pleasant experiences are actually gathered. Satisfaction in this teaching was never found by accumulating enough pleasant sensations. It was found by loosening the grip of craving itself. Two threads from this teaching are worth carrying tonight. First, that craving is described as inherently restless by nature, always already reaching toward the next experience, even while the current one is still unfolding, which means more sensation can never resolve it. Second, Buddhist teachers often point toward simple presence, full attention on a single breath, a single step, a single sound, as the practice that interrupts this grasping, not by denying pleasure, but by allowing it to be fully felt rather than immediately chased past. The runner's mountain path, walked slowly and noticed fully, became his version of this same quiet practice. You may recognize this pattern in your own evenings, scrolling for one more video, one more update, long after the genuine interest has faded into habit. Or in the way a vacation, once finally taken, gets photographed more than it gets actually experienced, your attention already halfway towards sharing it, rather than fully inside it. Perhaps you have noticed this at work too, finishing one project and immediately reaching for the next without letting the satisfaction of completion actually land. The runner's old habit, eyes already on the next finish line before the breath has even slowed, is easy to recognize once you start looking for it in your own days. Tonight, there is no next race. There is only this breath, this body, this bed. Let your attention land here fully, the way the runners eventually learn to land on a single cold morning, a single clean stride, without needing anywhere else to be. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Simplicity, Lao Tzu taught, reduces desire. The fewer ornaments a life carries, the less there is to defend, to polish, to worry over in the night. This is not poverty for its own sake. It is a recognition that every possession, every ambition, every accumulated thing asks something of us in return. Attention, maintenance, fear of loss. A simple life is not a smaller life. It is a life with more room in it, because so much of what we gather, gathered out of anxiety rather than need, ends up taking more than it gives. The one who wants less is not deprived. The one who wants less has simply stopped feeding a hunger that was never going to be satisfied by feeding it. There was once a keeper of the village granary, a careful man entrusted with storing grain against the winter and against the lean years that sometimes followed a poor harvest. He took his duties seriously, perhaps too seriously, and over the years his caution grew into something closer to fear. He began holding back grain that should have gone to families in need during ordinary winters, telling himself that an even harder winter might be coming, one that would require every last measure he could save. The villagers grumbled, but trusted him because he had been right before, once, many years earlier, when a famine had indeed come and his foresight had spared several families from starvation. That single success had calcified into a belief he could not shake, that he alone stood between the village and disaster, and that no amount of grain saved could ever be quite enough to guarantee their safety. His granary, over time, grew so full that grain at the bottom of the bins began to spoil from age before it was ever distributed, while families above ground went without during winters that were, by any honest measure, perfectly survivable. A young widow with 3 children came to him one bitter month, asking for a larger portion than he had allotted her, and he refused, citing the uncertainty of next year's harvest. She did not argue loudly. She simply asked him a question. "How much," she said, "would finally be enough for you to feel safe?" He started to answer, then stopped because he realized he did not actually know. "I am not certain," he admitted. "Then how will you know when to stop holding back?" "I suppose," he said slowly, "I will know it when I feel it." "And have you ever felt it? In all your years keeping this granary, has there ever been a season when you looked at what was stored and thought, 'This is sufficient, I can rest now'?" He searched his memory honestly and found, to his own discomfort, that he could not recall a single such season. Every harvest, however generous, had simply raised his sense of what might still be needed rather than settling it. The widow left without her larger portion that day, and the keeper sat alone in his granary that evening, surrounded by bins of grain stacked higher than he could reach without a ladder, feeling, for the first time in years, deeply uneasy about what he had built. He sought out an old rabbi who lived at the edge of the village, known for his quiet wisdom and his habit of answering questions with questions of his own. The keeper explained his trouble, the widow's question, the grain spoiling at the bottom of his bins, the fear that had calcified into something he no longer knew how to set down. The rabbi listened without interrupting, and when the keeper finished, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Tell me," he finally said, "what is the purpose of a granary?" "To feed the village," the keeper said. "And is grain that spoils in the bottom of a bin never distributed, feeding anyone?" The keeper shook his head slowly. "No, it is feeding nothing. It is only sitting there rotting while I tell myself I am being careful." "Then perhaps your caution has stopped serving its purpose," the rabbi said gently. "Caution that protects against famine is a virtue. Caution that hoards past the point of use, while people go hungry in the present to guard against a hunger that may never come, is something else. It wears the same clothes as wisdom, but it is fear, dressed carefully, so that even you mistake it for prudence." "How do I know the difference in the moment when I am deciding how much to give?" Ask yourself the widow's question each time before you decide. Not, what if the worst happens, but is this fear or is this care? Fear will always ask for one more measure held back. Care knows when enough has been set aside and gives the rest freely, trusting that tomorrow will be met as it comes. The keeper returned to his granary that night and, for the first time in years, opened the bins fully, distributing grain that had been sitting unused for seasons, giving the widow and several other families more than he had originally allotted them. He kept a sensible reserve, enough to weather an ordinary hard season, but no longer the impossible, ever-growing reserve his fear had been quietly demanding. He did not become careless. He simply became honest about the difference between prudence and hoarding, a distinction that took him the rest of his life to practice well, though he never again let grain spoil in the bottom of a bin while a family went hungry above it. Some years later, when a genuinely hard winter finally arrived, far harder than any he had prepared against during his most fearful years, He found that his sensible reserve, smaller though it was than his old impossible hoard, carried the village through well enough. The families he had once withheld grain from now brought him gifts of thanks, unaware that the reserve protecting them now was a fraction of what he had once guarded so anxiously. A young apprentice, training to take over the granary one day, asked him how he had known how much to set aside, now that his fear no longer dictated the amount. "I did not know with certainty," the keeper admitted. "I am not sure anyone ever knows with certainty. I learned instead to ask myself the widow's question each season before deciding, is this care or is this fear? Care sets aside a sensible measure and trusts the rest to providence and to next year's harvest. Fear can never set aside enough, because fear is not actually answering a question about grain. It is answering a question about safety that grain alone was never going to solve. And if you guess wrong, if the reserve runs short, then I will face that shortage honestly, the way every keeper before me eventually had to, rather than starving the village slowly today to guard against a hunger that might never come. I would rather be wrong occasionally in the direction of trust than be reliably, quietly cruel in the direction of fear." The apprentice carried this lesson with him in the years that followed, and though he too struggled sometimes with the old pull toward hoarding, he found, returning again and again to the widow's question, that it served him as faithfully as it had served his teacher before him. Decades later, when the apprentice had himself become the keeper of the granary, an unusually difficult harvest tested his resolve more sharply than any season before it. The rains had failed for 2 years running, and fear, old and familiar, rose in him exactly as it had once risen in his own teacher. He found himself standing before the bins late one night, calculating and recalculating how much he could safely give away, the same anxious arithmetic he remembered watching consume his teacher decades earlier. He nearly convinced himself that night that this season was different, that this fear was finally justified, that surely this was the hard winter that demanded total restriction rather than measured generosity. He went, instead, to sit a while at the edge of the village, the same spot where the widow had once asked her question of his teacher long before he was born. He asked himself, as honestly as he could manage, whether what he was feeling was care or fear. The answer, when it finally came, surprised him with its plainness. It was fear, dressed once again in the careful clothes of prudence, exactly as his teacher had warned him it would try to do. He returned to the granary and distributed what care rather than fear suggested was fair, keeping a sensible reserve but no more, trusting the village and the coming season the way his teacher had eventually learned to trust them. The winter that followed was hard, but survivable, and no family in the village went without more than they could bear. He never forgot afterward how close he had come that night to repeating the very mistake he had spent his whole career trying to avoid. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a similar understanding of this hoarding mind, often explored through stories of rabbis who taught that trust in providence, what is sometimes called bitachon, frees a person from the endless accumulation that fear demands. The Hasidic masters told many tales of wealthy men who could not sleep for worry over their fortunes, and poor men who slept soundly, trusting that what they needed would arrive as it was needed, day by day. Two threads from this tradition are worth holding tonight. First, that hoarding was often understood as a quiet failure of trust, a belief that one must personally guarantee the future through accumulation rather than meeting each day as it actually arrives. Second, the Hasidic masters taught that genuine generosity, giving freely from what one has rather than guarding it against an imagined future, was itself a spiritual practice, one that loosened the grip of fear more effectively than any amount of saved grain ever could. The granary keeper's fullest bins, in this light, were never really about safety. They were about a fear that had simply never been asked to explain itself. You may recognize this hoarding in smaller, quieter forms. Money saved so carefully that it is never spent on anything that would bring genuine joy. Vacation days left unused year after year out of a vague worry about needing them later. Generosity withheld from a friend because of an uncertain future that may never actually arrive. Each of these mirrors the granary keeper's bins, fuller than necessary, while something nearby quietly goes without. Perhaps you have noticed this in how you treat your own rest, saving it the way he saved his grain, telling yourself you will properly relax once some imagined threshold of security has been reached. That threshold, like his, may never arrive on its own. Tonight, you do not need to hold anything back. The day is finished. There is no harvest left to protect by staying alert any longer. Let your guard down the way the keeper eventually let down his, opening the bins, trusting that tomorrow will be met as it comes. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching, known in the West as the Tao Te Ching, speaks of the uncarved block, a simplicity so complete that nothing further needs adding to make it whole. There is a teaching hidden inside this image about creation itself, about knowing when a thing is finished rather than endlessly refining it past its natural completion. Many of us treat our work, our art, our very lives as projects that can never quite be called done, always one more revision away from acceptable. But Taoist teaching suggests that this endless refining is often its own kind of restlessness, mistaking activity for improvement. Sometimes the most finished thing is the one we stopped touching at exactly the right moment, trusting that what remained was already whole. There was a musician in a quiet mountain temple who played a simple wooden flute, and whose melodies were known throughout the valley for a clarity that other musicians, with their elaborate compositions, could never quite match. Visitors would travel from distant towns to hear him play a single short tune, one that lasted only a few minutes, and would leave feeling as though they had heard something far larger than its length suggested. The musician, despite this quiet renown, was never satisfied with his own compositions. Each time he finished a melody, he found himself returning to it the following week, adding an additional phrase, a flourish near the end, a new note he believed would deepen its meaning. His simple tunes grew longer and more elaborate year after year, until pieces that had once taken 3 minutes to play now stretched past 20, dense with ornamentation that even he sometimes lost his way inside. A young student came to study under him, eager to learn the secrets of his famous clarity, only to find that the master's current compositions bore little resemblance to the simple melodies that had first drawn her to seek him out. She listened to his newest piece, a sprawling work he had been revising for nearly 2 years, and found herself unmoved in a way she had not expected. "You do not like it," the master said, noticing her expression. "I am not certain," she admitted carefully. "It is impressive. But I came here because I once heard you play a short piece, years ago in another village, that I have never forgotten. I do not think this is the same kind of music." The master frowned, setting down his flute. "I have spent 2 years refining this piece. It is far more complex than anything I played years ago. Surely complexity, after years of practice, should represent improvement." "Perhaps," the student said, "or perhaps it represents something else. May I ask you a question, master, even though I am only a student and have no right to question your work?" "Ask." "When did you finish that older piece, the one I first heard, the simple one, before you began adding to it?" The master considered this. "I do not believe I ever finished it. I simply played it as it was for some years, and then began to feel that it could be improved, and I have been improving it since." "But the piece you played all those years ago, did it move people? Did it do what music is meant to do?" "It did. People wept sometimes hearing it. I have seen no one weep at this newer version, despite how much harder it is to play." The student was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I wonder," she finally said, "whether the piece was already finished all those years ago, and what you have been doing since is not improving it, but simply being unable to recognize that it had already arrived." The master sat with this for a long while, his hands resting on the flute he had not touched since the conversation began. "I have never thought to ask whether a piece could be finished before I had stopped adding to it," he admitted. "I assumed more attention always meant more value. I assumed that to stop working on something was to abandon it." "Is a flower abandoned?" the student asked gently, "once it has fully bloomed? Or has it simply become what it was always going to become, and any further change would only diminish it?" The master picked up his flute again, slowly, and tried to recall the original melody beneath all the additions he had layered onto it over the years. It took him some time, peeling back phrase after phrase, like clearing brush from a path that had once been clear and had grown overgrown through long neglect. When he finally found it, the simple tune from years before, unornamented, he played it through once and set the flute down, and said nothing for a long time. "It was already enough," he finally said, almost to himself. "It was," the student agreed. "I spent 2 years trying to improve something that did not need improving. I mistook my own restlessness for craftsmanship." The student did not answer this directly. She only asked if he might teach her the simple version, the one that had first drawn her to his temple, and he agreed, and in teaching it to her, found himself falling back in love with its plainness, the way one sometimes falls back in love with a familiar room after returning from an unnecessary, exhausting journey. He did not abandon composition entirely after that, but he grew more careful about the difference between a piece still finding its shape and a piece that had already arrived, and he learned, slowly, to recognize the particular quiet that settled over him when a melody was truly finished, a stillness that no amount of additional notes had ever managed to produce. Many years later, the same student, now a master in her own right, brought a piece of her own composing to him, eager for his judgment. He listened carefully, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, the way he had learned to be quiet before responding to anything important. "It is good," he finally said, "but I think there is one more phrase you are tempted to add near the ending." She looked at him, startled. "How did you know?" "I have been considering adding exactly that for the last week, because I once spent 2 years adding exactly such phrases to a piece that did not need them. I recognize the temptation when I hear a piece pause right at the edge of it." He picked up his own flute, the simple one she had first heard him play all those years ago, the melody now fully restored to its original plainness. "Play your ending again, the way it stands now, before you add anything more." She played it, and this time, listening with new attention, she heard what he meant. The piece already held its own complete shape. The phrase she had been considering would not have deepened it, it would have simply delayed the silence that was meant to follow, the silence that was, in its own way, as much a part of the composition as any note within it. "I understand now," she said. "The ending was already there. I was only afraid to let it actually end." "That fear," the old master said, smiling in the particular way he had once learned from her, all those years ago in this same temple, "is the most common reason any of us add one note too many, not because the piece needs it, because stopping asks us to trust that what we made was already enough." In Japanese Zen tradition, there is a similar understanding of this restraint, often expressed through the aesthetic principle of wabi-sabi, which finds completeness in simplicity and even in imperfection rather than in elaboration. A Zen garden, carefully raked, may contain only a few stones and a stretch of empty gravel, and yet feel more complete than a garden crowded with every flower its designer could find room for. The empty space is not a lack. It is part of the composition. 2 threads from this tradition are worth carrying tonight. First, Zen teachers often speak of ma, the meaningful pause or empty interval between things, suggesting that what is left out can carry as much weight as what is included, and that knowing where to stop is itself a form of mastery. Second, wabi-sabi teaches that a thing need not be elaborate or perfect to be complete, and that the impulse to keep refining can sometimes obscure a simplicity that was already, quietly, whole. The musician's overgrown melody and the Zen garden's empty gravel point toward the same lesson, learned through very different instruments. You may know this pattern from your own work, polishing an email so many times that the original honest message gets buried under careful phrasing, or revising a project at work long past the point where additional changes were actually improving it. The instinct to keep adding can feel like diligence, but it sometimes masks an inability to trust that something was already sufficient. Perhaps you have felt this in your own home, renovating a space that was already comfortable, certain that one more change would finally make it feel right, when the feeling you were chasing had nothing to do with the room at all. Tonight, there is nothing left to add to this day. It is complete as it stands, whatever shape it took. Let yourself feel the stillness of something finished, the way the old musician finally did, setting his flute down, trusting that what remained was already enough. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that the Tao accomplishes everything, yet claims nothing for itself, asks for nothing in return, and seeks no credit for what it has done. There is a humility hidden in this image, a model of action that finishes its work and then steps back rather than continuing to build long after the purpose has been served. Many of us struggle to recognize when a project, a role, or a chapter of life has actually reached its natural end. We keep adding, keep extending, mistaking continuation for purpose. But true completion sometimes looks like stopping, quietly, without ceremony, trusting that what was built will stand on its own without further additions. There was a builder in a coastal village who had constructed, over the course of his working life, a fine stone house for his family, set on a hill overlooking the water. It had everything a family could reasonably need: a hearth, sleeping rooms enough for his children, a kitchen with a wide window that caught the morning light. By any honest measure, the house was finished, and finished well, and his neighbors often remarked on how comfortable and complete it seemed. But the builder could not stop building. Each season he found some new reason to add another room, a space for guests who rarely visited, a second storage room beside the first, a covered walkway connecting buildings that had never needed connecting. His family watched the house grow stranger and more sprawling each year. Hallways leading to rooms that sat empty, doors opening onto spaces nobody used. His wife, gentle but increasingly tired of the noise and dust that never seemed to settle, finally asked him directly one evening why he kept building when the house had been complete for years already. "A house can always use more room," he said. "For what? The guest room sits empty. The new storage room holds nothing but the tools you used to build it." He considered this, but could not find an answer that satisfied even himself. "I am not certain," he admitted. "I think I simply feel uneasy when there is nothing left to build." His wife sat with him a while in silence, watching the evening settle over the half-finished addition, visible through their window. "Do you remember," she finally said, "when we first moved into this house, before any of the additions? Do you remember how it felt?" He thought back, surprised by how far away that memory now felt. "It felt like enough," he said slowly. "It felt complete, even though it was smaller than it is now." "And does it feel complete now, with all these added rooms?" He looked around at what the house had become, sprawling, half of it unused, dust gathering in corners that no one ever visited. "No," he admitted. "It feels unfinished somehow, despite being so much larger than it was." "Perhaps," his wife said gently, "the feeling you are chasing was never about the size of the house at all." He visited an old stonemason the following week, a man who had taught him much of his craft decades earlier and had long since retired from building anything larger than garden walls. The builder explained his trouble, the house that kept growing despite needing nothing more, the unease that arrived whenever there was nothing left to add. The old stonemason listened, then asked a question of his own. "When you build a wall," he said, "how do you know where it should end? At the edge of the property, or wherever the design calls for it to stop? And if you kept building past that point, adding stone after stone simply because you enjoyed building, what would happen to the wall? It would no longer serve its purpose. It would become something else, a strange extension that confuses anyone trying to understand where the property actually ends." "And is your house," the old stonemason asked, "still serving its purpose? Or has it become something else, a strange extension of a feeling you have not yet learned to name?" The builder was quiet for a long time, turning this over. "I think," he finally said, "I keep building because stopping feels like admitting that there is nothing more for me to do. As long as I am adding a room, I am still needed, still working toward something. If the house is finished, I am not certain what I am for." "Ah," the stonemason said, nodding slowly, as though this were the answer he had suspected from the beginning. "That is not a problem with your house. That is a question about what gives your days their shape once the building is done. Adding rooms will not answer that question. It will only postpone it, room by unnecessary room." The builder returned home that evening and stood for a long while looking up at his sprawling, half-finished house, the new addition still missing its roof, exposed to the coming rain. He did not finish that addition. He left it as it was, an unfinished wing attached to an otherwise complete home, and spent the following weeks doing something he had not done in years, simply sitting with his family in the evenings, in the rooms that had always been enough, without reaching for his tools at all. It took him longer than he expected to feel settled in this new stillness. But slowly, season by season, he found other things to fill the unease that building had once filled for him. Long walks along the coast, evenings spent teaching his children the craft he knew, quiet hours that asked nothing of him except to be present in them. The unfinished wing remained unfinished for the rest of his life, and he came eventually to think of it fondly, as a kind of monument to the question he had finally learned to ask himself before reaching for another stone. His eldest daughter, who had grown up watching the house sprawl strangely across the hillside, asked him once why he never finished that final wing, now that years had passed and he clearly could have completed it easily. "I leave it unfinished on purpose," he told her. "Why? It would only take a few weeks to put a roof on it." "Because every time I look at it, I remember the conversation that stopped me from finishing it. I remember asking myself why I was still building, long after the house had already become enough. If I finished that wing, I am afraid I would forget the question and simply look at a completed room instead, and feel the old unease returning, looking for some new wall to build against it." His daughter considered this, looking up at the roofless walls, open now to the sky, weather-worn after years of standing exposed. "It is a strange kind of monument," she said. "It is," he agreed, smiling, "but I have found I need strange monuments more than I need finished rooms. A finished room asks nothing of me. That unfinished wing asks me every single day I look at it whether I am building because something is actually needed or because I am uneasy and do not know what else to do with my hands. She did not fully understand his answer that day, being still young enough to believe that an unfinished house was simply an unfinished house. But she remembered the conversation many years later, when she found herself in her own adult life reaching for one more responsibility, one more project, simply to avoid the discomfort of an evening with nothing left to build. In Celtic wisdom, there is a similar understanding of this restless building, often expressed through reverence for the hearth and the home as a complete and sacred center, rather than something to be endlessly expanded. Celtic tradition placed great value on the dwelling as a place of belonging, tied closely to the land and the cycles of the seasons, where sufficiency was measured by warmth, shelter, and gathered family, rather than by size or grandeur. Two threads from this tradition are worth carrying tonight. First, Celtic wisdom often emphasized the thresholds of a home, its doors, its hearth, its boundary walls, as meaningful in themselves, places to be honored rather than continuously expanded past their original purpose. Second, this tradition held a deep respect for cycles and natural completion, recognizing that a home, like a season, has its own proper shape, and that forcing growth past that shape disrupts rather than improves what was already whole. The builders' sprawling additions in this light had quietly lost touch with the hearth they were meant to surround. You may recognize this restless building in your own life, taking on one more responsibility at work, not because it is needed, but because stillness feels uncomfortable, even threatening. Or in a relationship that is already steady and good, where you find yourself searching for problems to solve simply because solving feels more familiar than simply resting in what already works. Perhaps you have filled your calendar so completely that an empty evening feels like a failure rather than a gift, mistaking constant motion for a meaningful life. The builder's unfinished wing is worth remembering here. Sometimes the most honest thing we can do is stop adding and sit instead with what we already have. Tonight, there is nothing left to build. Let this day stand as it is, complete enough the way the builder's old house once was, before he forgot. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Lao Tzu taught, gives without taking, nourishes without controlling, and asks nothing in return. This is a vision of generosity entirely unlike the careful exchanges most of us learn to expect from life. Value given only because something equal will come back. A restless mind often treats giving the same way it treats acquiring, keeping score, wondering whether it has given enough or too much, whether the return will be adequate. But true contentment loosens this scorekeeping entirely. The person who gives freely, without measuring the return, discovers a strange kind of abundance, not because more comes back to them, but because the counting itself, which had quietly been exhausting, finally stops. There was a fisherman who lived along a wide river, known throughout his village for his skill with a net, able to read the water in ways other fishermen could not. Each morning he caught more than enough to feed his family and trade for what else they needed, and yet even after his basket was full, he often kept casting, telling himself that a larger catch would mean a larger trade, a more comfortable winter, a wider margin against whatever misfortune might come. This habit had a cost he did not notice at first. Fish he could not sell or eat began to spoil before he could give them away, wasted after the effort of catching them. His wife gently pointed this out more than once, but he continued the habit, unable to shake the feeling that a full basket was somehow not yet full enough. One morning, an elder from a neighboring village known for traveling the riverbanks and trading wisdom as readily as goods, watched him cast his net for the third time after his basket had already overflowed. The elder waited until the fisherman paused to mend a torn section of net before approaching. "Your basket is already more than full," the elder observed. "There is always room for more, if I find a way to carry it," the fisherman said. "And what will you do with what you cannot carry?" The fisherman considered the question, looking at the fish already spilling slightly over the basket's rim. "I suppose I will give some away, or it will spoil before I reach the village." "Then why catch it at all, if its fate is to spoil or to be given away regardless?" The fisherman opened his mouth to answer, then found he did not have a ready reply. "I am not sure," he admitted. "It feels wrong to stop while there are still fish in the water. Are there ever not fish in the water?" The fisherman laughed despite himself. "No, there are always more fish. The river does not run out simply because I stop casting for the day. Then the river will still be full of fish tomorrow, and the day after, whether or not you catch every last one of them today." The fisherman sat with this for a long moment, watching the current move past his ankles. "I think," he said slowly, "I have been treating the river as though it might disappear if I do not take from it quickly enough, as though my safety depends on taking more than I need every single day, just in case." The elder nodded, settling onto a flat rock near the water's edge. "I knew a fisherman once, many years ago in my own village, who fished exactly as you do, casting long after his basket was full, letting half his catch spoil rather than stopping at sufficiency. He believed, as you seem to believe, that abundance meant taking as much as possible whenever possible. What happened to him? He grew old, exhausted, his back bent from decades of unnecessary labor, his nets worn thin from overuse, and at the end of his life he had no more security than the fishermen who had stopped each day once their baskets were full. The extra fish he caught across all those years amounted, in the end, to nothing but spoiled waste and a tired body. The fishermen who stopped at enough were rested, their nets lasted longer, and their families were fed exactly as well. The fisherman looked at the overflowing basket beside him, then at the river still moving steadily past, indifferent to how much or how little he took from it that day. "What did the other fishermen do?" he asked, "with the time they saved by not catching more than they needed?" "They spent it with their families. They mended their nets properly instead of in haste. They sat by the river sometimes, simply watching it move, instead of pulling more from it than the day required." The fisherman gathered his already overflowing basket and did not cast his net again that morning, despite the unfamiliar discomfort of stopping while fish still moved visibly beneath the surface. He gave away the excess that evening to a family in his village who had fished poorly that week, and found, to his quiet surprise, that giving the extra away felt better than catching it ever had. In the seasons that followed, he learned slowly to stop each day once his basket held enough, resisting the old pull to cast one more time, just in case. His nets lasted longer. His evenings grew fuller with the family he had spent years too tired to properly enjoy, and the river, exactly as the elder had promised, remained full the next morning, and the morning after that, never once running short simply because he had trusted it enough to leave some fish swimming. One autumn, a poor season for fishing throughout the village, several other fishermen came to him anxiously, asking how he managed to feed his family so reliably when the river seemed to be giving less than usual to everyone else. "I have not changed how I fish," he told them. "I still stop once my basket holds enough. But the river is giving less this season. Surely you should cast more, not less, to make up for it." He considered this, remembering his own years of overcasting, the spoiled fish, the exhausted nets. "When the river gives less," he said slowly, "I have found it is wiser to want less from it, not to demand more. The seasons turn, some give generously, some give modestly. My family has never gone hungry in good seasons or lean ones, because I learned to ask only for what the day required, rather than always pushing for more than the river was offering." "That seems like a risk," one of the other fishermen said. "What if a truly hard winter comes and you have not gathered enough in reserve? Then I will face that winter as it comes, the way every winter eventually has to be faced. I no longer believe that exhausting myself today protects me from a hardship that has not yet arrived. I have tried that approach. It only exhausted me without actually protecting anyone." The other fishermen left unconvinced, some of them returning to their boats determined to cast longer hours than ever, certain that the lean season demanded more effort rather than less. He did not try to argue them out of it. He simply continued as he had for years, stopping each day at sufficiency, trusting the river the way he had slowly learned to, and found, as the season passed, that his family wanted for nothing, even while several of the more anxious fishermen, exhausted from overcasting into a river that simply did not have more to give that year, caught no more than he had, despite far longer hours spent chasing it. In the African philosophy of Ubuntu, there is a similar understanding of this generosity, often summarized in the phrase, "I am because we are." Ubuntu teaches that a person's well-being is inseparable from the well-being of their community, and that hoarding beyond one's needs, while others go without nearby, diminishes the hoarder as much as it harms the community around them. Wealth, in this view, is not a private fortress to be defended, but a flow to be shared, trusted to circulate and return in forms not always immediately visible. Two threads from this tradition are worth carrying tonight. First, Ubuntu philosophy holds that individual flourishing and communal flourishing cannot actually be separated, no matter how convincingly private accumulation seems to promise otherwise. Second, this tradition teaches that generosity is not a sacrifice of self-interest, but an expression of a deeper, more accurate understanding of what self-interest actually requires: connection, trust, and the steady give and take of a community that cares for its members. The fisherman's overflowing, spoiling basket, in this light, was never wealth at all. It was waste, mistaken for security. You may recognize this pattern in your own relationship to time and energy. Saying yes to one more task at work past the point of genuine usefulness simply because stopping feels like leaving value on the table. Or in how you might hold back help from a friend, worried that giving too freely will somehow leave you with less, when in truth, connection rarely works that way. Perhaps you have noticed this with your own rest, pushing through exhaustion to accomplish one more thing today, telling yourself the rest will keep until some more convenient evening that rarely actually arrives. The fisherman's overflowing basket slowly spoiling is a useful image to hold here. Sometimes more is simply more, without becoming better. Tonight, your basket, whatever it holds, is full enough. Let yourself stop casting, trusting that tomorrow's river will still be there, exactly as full as it is tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that those who know others are clever, but those who know themselves are truly wise. This wisdom of self-knowledge sits close to the heart of contentment, because so much restless wanting comes from a person who does not yet know what they actually need, chasing instead whatever seems desirable from the outside. A traveler who does not know their own course will mistake any direction for progress, even a circling, exhausting path that leads nowhere new. But the one who has taken the time to know their own capacity, their own true desires, can recognize sufficiency when it arrives, rather than endlessly searching past it for something better defined from elsewhere. There was a gardener on a hillside village who tended a modest plot of land that had, for generations, fed her family well through careful and attentive cultivation. The soil was good, but not unlimited, and over the years she had learned exactly how much it could sustain. A certain number of rows of vegetables, a certain number of fruit trees, enough to feed her household and trade a modest surplus at the village market. One year, after hearing of a neighboring village where farmers had cleared additional land and planted far more than their soil traditionally supported, she became convinced that her own plot was being underused. She began planting beyond what her careful experience had taught her the land could properly hold, crowding rows closer together, adding trees in spaces she had always left open for the soil to rest and recover. At first, the abundance of new growth excited her. The plot looked fuller, busier, more impressive to neighbors passing along the road. But as the season progressed, she noticed her plants growing thinner, their fruit smaller, the soil between them increasingly dry and exhausted by demands it had never been asked to meet before. By harvest, her yield was barely larger than in previous years, despite far more having been planted, and much of what grew was weak, undersized, hardly worth the labor of harvesting it. She sat at the edge of her overcrowded plot one evening, discouraged, when an old woman who had tended a neighboring garden for decades longer than she had been alive stopped to rest along the path. "Your garden looks tired," the old woman observed, not unkindly. "I planted more this year," the gardener admitted. "I thought a fuller garden would yield a fuller harvest." "And did it?" "No, It yielded almost the same as before, but everything in it looks exhausted, including me. The old woman walked slowly along the rows, examining the crowded plants, the dry soil between them. "Tell me," she said, "how did you decide how much to plant in previous years?" "I learned over time how much this particular soil could properly support. I tested it season after season until I understood its limits." "And this year?" "This year I planted based on what I saw in someone else's garden, on land I have never tended, soil I do not know the way I know my own." The old woman nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had long suspected. "I have tended gardens on this hillside for many decades," she said. "I have seen many gardeners make exactly this mistake. They look at a neighbor's larger plot and assume that more is simply better, without asking whether their own soil, their own water, their own particular conditions could actually support what they are about to demand of it. How do I know what my own soil can actually support, rather than simply guessing? You already knew, before this year. You had tested it carefully, season after season, until you understood your own land's true capacity. The trouble was never a lack of knowledge. The trouble was a moment of doubt, when someone else's larger garden made you question what you had already learned firsthand. The gardener looked at her crowded rows, the exhausted soil, the smaller fruit hanging weakly from overburdened branches. "I think," she said slowly, "I have been measuring my garden against a soil I do not actually have, rather than tending the soil that is actually mine." "That is precisely the trouble," the old woman agreed. "A garden can only give what its particular soil can support, no matter how large a neighboring garden grows on different ground. Knowing your own soil, its limits, its particular needs, is worth more than any comparison to land you will never actually tend." The gardener spent the following season returning her plot to the spacing and the planting she had originally learned through years of careful attention, removing some of the overcrowded additions, letting the soil rest in places it had always needed rest. The harvest that followed was smaller in total number than her overcrowded attempt had been, but each plant grew fuller, each fruit grew larger, and the soil itself, no longer exhausted, recovered a richness it had been slowly losing. She never again compared her plot to her neighbor's larger land. She understood, finally, that her garden's proper size had nothing to do with anyone else's garden at all. It had only to do with the particular soil she had spent years coming to know, intimately, the way one comes to know a person, rather than a number on a scale. A young woman from a nearby village came to her some years later, asking to learn gardening, having heard of the steady harvests this particular hillside plot produced year after year, season after season, without fail. "I want a garden as large as the one in the neighboring valley," the young woman said, naming the very farm whose example had once tempted the older gardener into overcrowding her own rows. The gardener smiled, recognizing something of her own younger uncertainty in the request. "Have you tested your own soil yet? Do you know what it can support?" "Not yet. I was hoping you could simply tell me how large to make it." "I cannot tell you that," the gardener said. "Your soil is not my soil. It might support more than mine does, or far less. The only way to know is to test it carefully, season after season, the way I tested mine, rather than borrowing a number from a neighbor's land you have never actually worked." That sounds slower than simply copying what already works elsewhere. It is slower, the gardener agreed, but a garden built on borrowed numbers rather than on your own soil's actual truth will eventually show its strain the way mine once did. I learned that the hard way, exhausting my land in a single over-ambitious season. I would rather you learn it gently, through patient testing, than through the exhaustion I once put my own soil through. The young woman left with less certainty than she had arrived with, but also, the gardener suspected, with a more honest starting point than the one she had originally hoped for. In Polynesian wayfinding tradition, there is a similar understanding of this self-knowledge, expressed through the navigator's deep, intimate knowledge of their own vessel, their own body, and the particular conditions of the ocean around them, rather than any fixed external measurement. Traditional navigators crossed vast stretches of open ocean without instruments, relying instead on the feel of the swell beneath the hull, the position of stars they had memorized since childhood, and an intimate understanding of their own canoe's particular behavior in different conditions. Two threads from this tradition are worth carrying tonight. First, wayfinding depended entirely on knowing one's own vessel and one's own body so completely that external instruments became unnecessary. A kind of self-knowledge so thorough it became a form of navigation itself. Second, navigators trusted this internal knowledge over any comparison to other vessels or other routes, understanding that their own canoe, their own conditions, required a path suited specifically to them, regardless of how another voyager might cross the same waters differently. The gardener's overcrowded plot, in this light, was a navigator briefly trusting someone else's stars over her own deeply earned knowledge of her particular sea. You may recognize this pattern in your own life, taking on a pace of work that suits a colleague's energy and circumstances, but exhausts your own, simply because their plot looks fuller from the outside. Or in pushing your body toward a fitness routine designed for someone else's particular needs, ignoring what your own years of attention have already taught you about your own limits. Perhaps you have compared your financial choices to a friend's larger investments, doubting your own carefully tested approach simply because theirs looked more impressive from a distance. The gardener's exhausted soil is worth remembering here. What works for someone else's particular ground may quietly exhaust your own. Tonight, trust what you already know about your own soil, your own capacity, your own particular need for rest. Let that trusted knowledge, rather than any comparison, be enough to let you finally close your eyes. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and that the wise traveler does not need to see the entire road to walk it well. There is a quiet teaching about presence hidden in this image, about the difference between a journey undertaken to collect proof of having traveled and a journey lived fully, step by step, wherever it happens to lead. A restless mind treats travel, and much of life besides, as something to be gathered, evidence to be displayed afterward. But contentment lives closer to the ground, in the actual step being taken right now, rather than in whatever can later be shown as proof that the step occurred. There was a traveller who journeyed through many villages over the course of several years, collecting a small token from each place she visited. A carved bead, a strip of woven cloth, a polished stone, anything small enough to carry that might serve as proof of where she had been. Her collection grew heavy over the years, filling first a small pouch, then a larger satchel, then eventually requiring a separate pack she carried specifically for the tokens themselves, distinct from her food and her bedding. She had begun collecting these tokens with genuine joy, each one calling back a particular memory of a particular place. But somewhere along the way, the collecting itself had become the point, more important than the memories it was meant to preserve. She found herself rushing through new villages, gathering a token quickly so she could move on to the next one, rather than lingering long enough to actually know the place she was passing through. In one village, set in a valley known for its careful weavers, she sought out a woman selling cloth at the market, intending only to purchase a small strip for her collection and continue on her way before nightfall. The weaver, noticing the traveller's hurried manner, asked her a simple question while wrapping the cloth. "Where are you travelling from? And where are you travelling to?" The traveller answered with the names of several villages, a long list strung together, more interested in conveying the scope of her journey than in actually answering the question. "That is many places," the weaver said. "What did you find in each of them?" The traveller reached automatically for her heavy pack of tokens, ready to display its contents as an answer. Then she paused, realizing she could remember the tokens far more clearly than she could remember the actual places they had come from. "I am not entirely certain," she admitted slowly. "I remember gathering things in each place. I am having trouble remembering the places themselves." The weaver nodded, as though this were not the first time she had heard such an answer from a hurried traveller passing through her village. "May I ask how long you intend to stay in my village before continuing on?" "Until tomorrow morning, I think. I have many more villages to reach before the season turns." "And what will you remember of my village a year from now, beyond the strip of cloth in your pack?" The traveller had no ready answer for this. She looked around the market, really looked, for what felt like the first time since arriving, the particular pattern of the weaver's looms, the smell of dye drying in the sun, the sound of a language slightly different from the one spoken in the last village she had passed through. She realized she had been so focused on acquiring the cloth that she had barely noticed any of this. "I do not know," she admitted. "I suppose I will remember that I was here because I will have the cloth to prove it. But I'm not certain I will remember what being here actually felt like." "That seems like a strange kind of travelling," the weaver said gently. "To pass through so many places and remember mostly the objects rather than the places themselves." "I did not intend for it to become this way," the traveller said. "When I began this journey, I collected tokens because they reminded me of moments I had loved. Somewhere along the way, I think I started collecting tokens simply to have collected them, and the moments stopped mattering as much as the proof that I had been present for them." "What would happen," the weaver asked, "if you stayed in one village a little longer than you planned without rushing toward the next one?" not to collect more, but simply to actually be here, in this particular place for a while. The traveller considered the heavy pack on her shoulders, the dozens of tokens it held, each one representing a village she could barely picture clearly anymore. "I think," she said slowly, "I would be afraid that I was wasting time, falling behind some schedule I never actually set for myself." Falling behind? Toward what destination? The traveller had no answer for this either. She realized, sitting in the weaver's market stall with the unfinished cloth between them, that she had never actually decided where her journey was supposed to end, or what she hoped to find when it did. She had simply kept moving, village to village, token to token, without ever asking herself what the moving was actually for. She stayed in that village 3 additional days, longer than she had stayed anywhere in many months, learning the weaver's craft a little, eating meals slowly instead of hurriedly, listening to stories told around the evening fire without immediately reaching for her notebook to record them. When she finally continued her journey, she carried the same strip of cloth she had originally intended to buy. But she also carried something else, harder to name, a fuller memory of an actual place, rather than simply a token representing it. She did not stop collecting entirely after that, but she traveled differently in the years that followed, staying longer in fewer places, gathering fewer tokens but remembering each one far more vividly, until her collection, smaller than it might have been, became something she could actually hold in her mind as well as in her pack. Years later, when she had finally settled in one village permanently, a young traveller passing through asked to see her famous collection, having heard stories of the many places she had visited over her long years on the road. She brought out the smaller, later collection first, the handful of tokens gathered after her conversation with the weaver, and found she could tell a rich, detailed story about each one, the particular light in that valley, the song an old woman had taught her there, the taste of a meal shared with strangers who became, briefly, like family. Then she brought out the earlier collection, the dozens of tokens gathered hastily in her hurried years, and found, try as she might, that most of them brought back nothing at all, simply objects without memory attached. "Which collection do you treasure more?" the young traveller asked, looking at the 2 piles, one so much larger than the other. "The smaller one," she answered without hesitation. "Every object in it holds an actual place inside it. The larger pile holds nothing but proof that I once passed through somewhere, quickly, without actually arriving." "I am about to begin my own journey," the young traveller said. "What would you tell me, knowing what you know now?" "Travel slower than you think you need to," she said. "Gather less than you are tempted to gather, and every time you feel the urge to rush toward the next place, ask yourself honestly whether you have actually finished being present in this one." The young traveller left with this advice carried more carefully than any souvenir, and the woman, watching her go, felt something close to peace, knowing that a small piece of her own hard-earned lesson would now travel onward into roads she herself would never walk again. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, there is a similar understanding of this presence, expressed through song lines. The pathways of ancestral stories that map the land not as territory to be passed through quickly, but as a living relationship to be walked attentively, generation after generation. A songline is not simply a route from one place to another. It is a way of knowing a place so completely that the land and the story become inseparable, carried not in objects but in memory, song, and attentive presence. Two threads from this tradition are worth carrying tonight. First, songlines teach that a journey's meaning comes from deep attention to each place along the way, not from the distance covered or the destinations reached, a way of traveling that values depth of presence over breadth of coverage. Second, this knowledge is carried internally through story and song passed between generations rather than through external objects, suggesting that the truest record of a journey lives in memory and relationship rather than in anything that can be packed away and carried separately. The traveller's heavy pack of tokens in this light had quietly become a substitute for the deeper remembering she was capable of all along. You may recognize this pattern in your own travels, photographing a sunset so urgently that you miss actually watching it, gathering souvenirs from a trip you can barely recall in detail a year later. Or in how you might move through your own days, checking off accomplishments without pausing long enough to actually feel the satisfaction each one was meant to offer. Perhaps you have noticed this at gatherings with people you love, more focused on capturing the moment for later than on actually being present within it while it is happening. The traveller's heavy pack of tokens is worth remembering here. Proof of presence is not the same as presence itself. Tonight there is nothing to capture, nothing to prove. There is only this moment, this bed, this breath. Let yourself simply be here, the way the traveller finally learned to be, fully inside the place she had been rushing past. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that he who is attached to things will suffer much, while he who saves things excessively will suffer deep loss. There is a teaching here about the gap between wanting and having, a gap that widens the more tightly something is grasped. A child reaching for a second helping before finishing the first rarely tastes either one fully. The grasping itself becomes the experience, crowding out the simple satisfaction that was available the whole time in the bowl already in hand. Contentment in this light is not about refusing more. It is about finishing what is already present before reaching for what is not yet there. There was a child in a farming household who was given each evening a generous bowl of rice for supper, enough to satisfy any reasonable hunger after a day spent helping in the fields. And yet, almost before the bowl was finished, the child would look up and ask for more, certain that another portion would feel better than the one already being eaten. His grandmother, who prepared the family's meals, noticed this pattern continue for many months. The child rarely finished a bowl with any sense of satisfaction. He ate quickly, distracted, his attention already on the next portion he hoped to receive, rather than on the food actually in front of him. When she gave him a second bowl, as she usually did, he ate that one the same way, eyes already drifting toward whether a third might be offered. One evening, after the child had finished his first bowl in his usual hurried way and asked, as always, for more, the grandmother set down the serving spoon instead of immediately refilling his bowl. "Before I give you more," she said, "tell me how the rice you just ate tasted." The child paused, surprised by the question. He tried to recall and found that he could not describe it clearly at all. "I am not sure," he admitted. "I do not remember tasting it very much." "Why not?" "I suppose I was thinking about asking for more, even while I was still eating it." The grandmother nodded, as though this confirmed something she had long suspected. "Would you like to try something different tonight?" "What kind of different?" "I will give you another bowl, the same size as before, but this time, before you ask for more, I want you to actually taste what is in front of you. Eat slowly enough to notice the rice, the way it smells, the way it feels. Tell me, when you finish, whether you are actually still hungry, or whether you simply want more because wanting more has become a habit." The child agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and the grandmother filled his bowl again. He ate more slowly this time, awkwardly at first, unused to paying attention to food he had always eaten quickly on his way to asking for the next portion. Partway through the bowl, he looked up. "It tastes better when I eat slowly," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "Does it?" "Yes, I can taste that grandmother cooked it with the broth from yesterday's vegetables. I never noticed that before." "What else do you notice?" The child continued eating more attentively now, and by the time he finished the bowl, he sat for a moment before speaking. "I think," he said slowly, "I might actually be full. Not the way I usually feel full, where I still want more even though my stomach is uncomfortable. I feel satisfied." "And if I offered you a third bowl right now, would you want it?" The child considered this honestly, testing the question against the actual feeling in his body rather than against the old habit of automatically asking. "No," he said, sounding almost confused by his own answer. "I do not think I want more tonight." The grandmother smiled and set the serving spoon aside. "That is a very useful thing to notice," she said. "Most people, grown adults as much as children, ask for more out of habit, without ever pausing to ask their own body whether more is actually wanted. The wanting becomes automatic, separate from the actual hunger it claims to be answering. Will I always want more, the way I used to? Perhaps sometimes. Habits are persistent, and old patterns return more often than we would like. But now you know something you did not know before, that you can pause before reaching for more and ask yourself honestly whether the wanting is real hunger or simply a habit of wanting that has nothing to do with your actual stomach. The child grew older over the following years and did not perfectly remember his grandmother's lesson every single evening. Some nights, old habit pulled him toward a third bowl out of distraction rather than hunger, exactly as it always had. But more and more often, as the seasons turned, he found himself pausing partway through a meal, checking honestly with his own body, and discovering, more often than not, that the second helping he reached for automatically was not actually something his hunger required at all. It was simply a habit dressed up as appetite that a moment of honest attention could quietly set down. In Mayan cosmology, there is a similar understanding of this attentive sufficiency, expressed through deep reverence for maize, the staple crop considered sacred, deserving of careful attention rather than careless consumption. traditional practice treated each meal as worthy of mindful gratitude, recognizing the labor of planting, tending, and harvesting that brought the food to the table, rather than treating it as something to be consumed quickly and without notice. Two threads from this tradition are worth carrying tonight. First, Mayan cosmology held that the relationship between people and the staple crops sustaining them was reciprocal and sacred, requiring attention and gratitude rather than the kind of distracted consumption that forgets where food actually comes from. Second, this tradition understood cycles of giving and receiving as fundamentally balanced, suggesting that taking more than is needed disrupts a harmony that careful, attentive sufficiency helps maintain. The child's hurried, distracted bowl of rice in this light had quietly lost touch with the attention his grandmother's careful cooking actually deserved. You may recognize this pattern in your own meals, eating quickly in front of a screen, barely tasting what is actually in front of you, while already thinking about the next thing on your plate or your schedule. Or in how you consume entertainment, moving restlessly from one show to the next without finishing one fully, attention scattered across a dozen unfinished things rather than settled into any single one. Perhaps you have noticed this in conversations too, half listening to someone speak while your mind drifts toward what you will say next, missing the actual moment of connection being offered. The child's hurried bowl of rice is worth remembering here. What is in front of you right now deserves your full attention before you reach for anything else. Tonight, this bed, this breath, this body is the bowl in front of you. Let yourself taste it fully, the way the child eventually learned to, before any thought of reaching further. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that excessive desire leads a person far from themselves, scattering attention across countless objects until none of them can be properly held. There is a final teaching here, gathering many of the threads we have walked through tonight, that the mind-chasing acquisition is, in a real sense, fleeing from something, even if it cannot name what. Each new object promises to fill a particular emptiness, and each one, once obtained, reveals that the emptiness remains, prompting another search. He who knows enough, by contrast, has stopped fleeing. He has turned to face whatever the chasing was always trying to avoid, and found, to his quiet surprise, that it was never as frightening as the endless running had suggested. There was a collector in a mountain kingdom who gathered rare and beautiful objects throughout his long life. Carved jade figures, polished gemstones, delicate porcelain brought from distant lands by traders who knew his reputation and sought him out specifically. His collection, displayed across many rooms of his house, was the finest in the entire region, admired by every visitor who came to see it. And yet the collector himself rarely seemed to enjoy what he had gathered. He moved through his rooms of treasures with a restless energy, always noticing the one object missing from a particular set, the one carving slightly inferior to another he had seen elsewhere and not yet acquired. Visitors marveled at his collection. He, standing among it, felt only the gap between what he had and what he still wanted. In his later years, as his health began to fail, he summoned a healer from a distant village, known for treating ailments that other physicians could not name. The healer examined him carefully, asked about his habits and his sleep, and finally asked to see the famous collection he had heard so much about. The collector led him through room after room, each filled with treasures gathered across a lifetime. The healer admired several pieces genuinely, but noticed something else as they walked. The collector's eyes did not rest on any single object for long. They moved restlessly from piece to piece, the way a hungry animal's eyes might move across a field, never settling. "You have gathered remarkable things," the healer said when they had finished the tour. "I have," the collector agreed, "though I am missing several pieces I have long wanted. A particular jade carving from the eastern provinces, a certain blue porcelain bowl I saw once as a young man and have never been able to find again. And if you found these missing pieces, would your collection finally feel complete?" The collector considered this, and something in his expression suggested he already suspected the honest answer before he spoke it aloud. "I am not certain," he admitted. "I have completed smaller sets before, only to notice a different gap opening elsewhere, in some other corner of the collection." "How long have you been collecting?" "Nearly 50 years. And in 50 years, has there ever been a single day when you looked at everything you had gathered and felt that it was, finally, enough?" The collector was quiet for a long time, walking slowly back through the rooms they had just toured, looking at his treasures with what seemed like new and uncomfortable attention. "No," he finally said, "I do not believe there has been a single such day." "What do you think you have actually been gathering all these years beneath the jade and the porcelain?" The collector stopped walking entirely, standing among his treasures, and for a long moment said nothing. "I do not know," he finally admitted. "I began collecting after my wife died many years ago. I remember that each new object seemed to ease something briefly, before the feeling returned and I needed another piece to ease it again." "And has any single object in 50 years eased that feeling permanently?" "No," the collector said, his voice quieter now. "Not one. Not even the finest pieces in this entire collection." The healer sat down on a low bench near the largest display case, gesturing for the collector to join him. "I cannot cure grief with medicine," he said gently. "No physician can. But I can tell you what I have observed, treating many patients across many years who tried to fill an old sorrow with new acquisitions. The objects never worked, not truly, no matter how rare or beautiful they were. They only delayed the moment when the actual grief would need to be faced directly, rather than buried beneath one more treasure. Are you suggesting I face it now, after 50 years? I am suggesting that the jade carving from the eastern provinces will not do what you are quietly hoping it will do. I think you already know this, somewhere beneath the wanting. The question is whether you are ready to stop reaching past your grief and instead sit with it directly, the way one finally sits with an old friend who has been waiting patiently outside the door for a very long time. The collector did not acquire any new pieces in the time remaining to him. He spent his final months instead walking slowly through his existing rooms, looking at each object not as a placeholder for some future acquisition, but as itself, complete, sufficient, holding its own particular beauty without needing to be compared to whatever piece might still be missing. He spoke for the first time in decades about his late wife, about the grief he had buried beneath 50 years of careful, restless gathering. It did not erase the grief, but it changed his relationship to it and to the treasures surrounding him, which he found himself, finally, able to simply enjoy. His niece, who visited often during those final months, noticed the change before he ever explained it to her. She had grown up watching him pace restlessly among his treasures, and was startled to find him instead sitting quietly beside a small jade carving one afternoon, simply looking at it, the way one might look at an old photograph. "You seem different," she said. "I am trying something different," he admitted. "For most of my life I looked at these rooms and saw what was missing. I am trying now to see what is actually here instead." "Is it working?" He considered the question honestly. "Some days. Other days the old habit returns, and I find myself thinking again about the jade carving from the eastern provinces I was never able to find. But even on those days I notice the wanting now, instead of simply being swept along by it without realizing. That noticing is new. I do not think I had it before. What changed?" A healer asked me a question I had never once asked myself in 50 years of gathering. He asked whether any single object had ever eased the feeling I was gathering against. I had to admit, finally, that none of them had. Once I admitted that, I am not sure I could keep gathering the same way I always had. His niece sat with him a while longer that afternoon, and in the months that followed, long after he had passed, she found herself remembering that conversation whenever she caught herself reaching for some new object to ease a restlessness she could not quite name. She did not become a different person overnight either, but she carried her uncle's late hard-won lesson forward, the way a person carries a small stone in their pocket, returning to it when the old habit of reaching threatened to take hold again. She inherited the collection eventually, all the jade and porcelain gathered across his 50 restless years, and rather than adding to it or selling it off, she chose simply to keep it as it was, a finished thing, a record of a life, rather than an unfinished project still demanding new acquisitions. Visitors who came to see it sometimes asked why she never expanded it further, certain that a collection of such quality deserved continued growth. "It is already complete," she would tell them, "not because every possible piece has been gathered, but because my uncle finally stopped needing it to be anything other than what it already was. I think that completeness is worth more than anything I could add to it now." "But surely a few more pieces would only make it finer." "Perhaps," she would say, smiling the way her uncle had learned to smile late in his life, once the restless gathering had finally loosened its grip. "But I have learned something from watching him spend 50 years reaching past what he already held. I am in no hurry to make the same mistake with what he eventually, gratefully, learned to set down." Visitors sometimes left her house a little disappointed, having hoped to see a collection still growing, still chasing the next rare and impressive piece. But others left thoughtful, quieter than when they had arrived, carrying with them a question they had not expected to bring home. What exactly were they themselves still reaching for, and whether the reaching had ever actually been about the object at all? In Norse mythology, there is a similar understanding of this restless gathering, often explored through the story of the dragon Fafnir, who guarded a great hoard of gold so obsessively that he transformed, quite literally, into a creature incapable of anything but guarding it. Fafnir's hoard brought him no joy, no companionship, no peace. It brought him only an endless, isolated vigilance, trapped beside treasure he could never actually enjoy, because enjoying it would have required setting down his guard, even briefly. Two threads from this myth are worth carrying tonight. First, Norse tradition frequently depicted hoarded wealth as a curse rather than a blessing, transforming its keeper into something smaller and more isolated than they had been before the gathering began. Second, the myth suggests that what begins as acquisition can become identity, until a person cannot imagine themselves apart from what they have gathered, even when the gathering has clearly stopped serving them. The collector's restless rooms of jade and porcelain in this light were his own quieter version of Fafnir's hoard, guarded faithfully against an emptiness no amount of treasure could actually fill. You may recognize this pattern in your own gathering, whether of possessions, achievements, or even relationships collected for status rather than genuine connection. Perhaps you have noticed a sadness or a restlessness beneath your own wanting, something the next purchase or the next achievement has always promised to ease, without ever quite delivering on that promise. Perhaps, too, you have sensed that beneath the wanting lies something simpler and more vulnerable than the wanting itself admits. A grief, a fear, a loneliness that no object was ever actually built to answer. The collector's jade and porcelain, gathered across 50 years, never once touched the grief they were meant to ease. Tonight, you do not need to gather anything more. Whatever you are carrying beneath the wanting is welcome here, in this dark room, exactly as it is, without needing to be solved before you sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with Lao Tzu's teaching on contentment and knowing enough. And over these 13 chapters, we let that question open slowly from many different sides. We met a merchant who counted his coins each evening, certain the right number would finally let him rest, and a farmer who measured his harvest against a neighbor's, forgetting to look at his own field at all. We watched a young cook fill a bowl past its rim, only to learn that a cup carried steadily matters more than a cup filled completely. We sat with a collector of rare books, certain that one more volume would finally complete her understanding, and a runner who crossed finish line after finish line without ever once feeling that he had arrived. We listened as a granary keeper learned the difference between care and fear, and as a musician finally set down his flute, recognizing a melody that had been complete for years. We watched a builder add room after room to a house that needed nothing more, and a fisherman cast his net long after his basket had already overflowed. We followed a gardener who planted past what her own soil could hold, and a traveller who gathered tokens from every village without remembering the villages themselves. We sat beside a child slowing down long enough to actually taste his rice, and finally a collector whose jade and porcelain could never quite reach the grief hiding beneath all that gathering. Across all these stories, a single thread kept reappearing, dressed differently each time but never truly changing shape. We are not what we have gathered. We are not the number in the ledger, the size of the harvest, the fullness of the cup, the length of the melody, the number of rooms in the house, the weight of the basket, the size of the garden, the weight of the pack, the size of the portion, or the rarity of the treasure. We are not, in the end, measured by anything that can be counted, compared, or displayed. We are something quieter than that. We are the noticing itself, the capacity to look at what is already here in this single ordinary moment and recognize, even briefly, that it is enough. This is the central teaching Lao Tzu left for us across all these different images. He who knows he has enough is rich. Not he who has much, not he who has finally caught up to some imagined horizon, simply he who knows, who turns toward what is already present and lets it be sufficient, at least for this evening, at least for this breath. Restlessness is rarely about what is actually lacking. It is about a mind trained, gently and over many years, to always reach past whatever it is currently holding. And the cure, if there is one, is not more. It is simply a willingness to stop reaching for a while and notice what was quietly already here. We do not master this teaching once and carry it with us forever afterward, finished, complete, never again needing to return to it. We come back to it again and again, the way the merchant returned to his ledger some evenings despite his progress, the way the gardener occasionally still glanced toward her neighbor's larger plot before remembering her own soil. Contentment is not a destination reached and then permanently inhabited. It is a door we learn, slowly, to find our way back to, evening after evening, each time the wanting mind pulls us away from what is already enough. This is not failure. This is simply what it means to be human, practicing something gently, across an entire lifetime, rather than perfecting it in a single sitting. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.